Well, hello, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar, FDA's Food Traceability Rule, Going Beyond Regulatory Compliance with Ambient IoT. So this event is brought to you by Food Safety Magazine and sponsored by Wiliot. I'm Adrienne Bloom, Editorial Director of Food Safety Magazine, and I'll be your moderator for today's webinar, and I want to thank you for joining us here today. So today's presenters on this webinar are Frank Yiannas, food safety culture expert and former FDA Deputy Commissioner of Food Policy and Response, and also Steve Statler, Chief Marketing Officer at Wiliot. So I will be rejoining the presenters at the end to answer your questions that come in throughout the webinar, so don't forget to submit those in the Q&A and chat sections of the webinar console. Today's event is also being recorded and will be archived on food-safety.com. So with that said, I'm excited to turn it over to our presenters, Frank and Steve. Take it away, guys.
Adrienne, thanks so much for your intro. Thank you to everyone at Food Safety Magazine. And thanks to everyone that is attending or watching the recording. The response has been amazing. A lot of interest in this check-in with Frank. We announced that Frank Yiannas is joined Wiliot as a strategic advisor. Frank, we really appreciate your engagement with us. It's been an honor and also a pleasure. Anyone that listened to the podcast interview that we did together will, I think, guess that there's some great chemistry there. We share a love of 80s new wave music, and if anyone wants to know exactly which bands are Frank's favorites, then they can listen to the podcast. But Frank, more seriously, this is a very important topic. It's very important to us. Thank you for your support.
It's always a pleasure working with you and Wiliot. And for those that are tuning in today, thank you for joining us. We have a large turnout. It's really impressive. And Steve and I realize that there's a lot you could be doing today. The fact that you've tuned in means a lot. We know that in this broad audience, there's a diversity of perspectives on food traceability. Some are very mature on their journey and continuum on what the new food traceability rule means to them and their organizations, and some are still coming up to speed and learning about it. But I assure you, we're going to have a good discussion on not only complying, but going beyond compliance in a manner that adds even greater value to the food system. So thank you for joining us.
Very good. Well, we're going to start off. Frank and I are going to take you through the agenda. So I think most of the audience here know and are familiar with some of the terminology and jargon around FSMA 204. Many of you are experts, but you may not have heard of Ambient IoT. Ambient computing has been around for decades. Ambient IoT is the subject of not just what Wiliot does, the Internet of Things, connecting the real physical world, food, medicine, clothing, to the power of the cloud, opening the portal between generative AI and the real world is what Ambient IoT is about. We're going to explain that, and that's going to be the subject of my first part of the agenda, and then Frank will follow me.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Dave. I think it's so important for people to gain a better understanding of Ambient IoT and what it does and what it does not do. But then I'm going to try to provide a high-level overview on the food traceability rule, often referred to as Section 204, and what I think is the current state. I'm spending a lot of time listening to stakeholders and food producers. So I got a pretty good lay of the land, and I'm going to try to offer some tidbits.
I'm going to follow up, and we're going to have a recap, basically using some coverage that on CNBC to make sure that everyone's level set. And then we'll get into how this technology is being applied to Ambient, to FSMA 204. And then I'll hand back to Frank, who will bring it home for the final part of the session.
Yeah, please, if you can, stick around to the end, because we're going to close on a discussion about the future of a safer, smarter, and more sustainable food system, and have a conversation about changing the compliance paradigm. And you'll hear my explanation on how we've been operating using a 20th century framework on compliance whether it's food safety or any compliance matters related to the safety of food. And we're on the cusp of, I think we're on the leading edge with this type of technology and approach to change that paradigm completely to drive radical improvements.
But before we get into any of that, we want to turn things over to you. We've got a very interesting audience. You have your own perspective on readiness for FSMA 204, and we'd love it if you can click and join in and share your assessment of your organization's readiness to be compliant with FSMA Rule 204 and that Tuesday, January the 20th, 2026 deadline. Frank, whilst we're just waiting for a few more votes to come in, what's your expectation here when you were drafting, architecting Rule 204? At this stage, were you expecting everyone to be confident and ready?
Well, we had a lot of debates inside the walls of what I call White Oak, FDA home campus. What should be a compliant state? If you look at what happened with the Drug Supply Chain Security Act, that was a work in progress for over a decade. But we're very far along from when that started, Steve, and we have new and emerging technologies like the one we're talking today. So we knew it would be a stretch goal, but we believe that it's totally achievable, that by and large, most organizations will be able to comply, that have to comply by January of 2026. And at that time, and I think it'll still be the case, FDA is going to stay true to their educate before and while they regulate. So we can do this. And more importantly, we're going to do this.
Well, let's see what the audience says. So we've got a good spread, but the bias is an optimistic one. Confidence that the deadline will be met. There's probably some healthy concerns there, and I think we can expect at this stage that we're now in a stage where people are really very conscious of the challenges that they face, and this reflects a lot of what we're seeing as we're engaging with some of the largest food companies in the world. So you have all heard of Frank, I'm sure. Many of you will not have heard of Wiliot. So let me take a slide to just introduce you to the company. We describe ourselves as an ambient Internet of Things data carrier platform. So what does that mean? Essentially, ambient IoT, it looks like an RFID tag. It's in fact made using the same machines. A lot of the companies that you know, companies like Avery Dennison, the largest maker of RFID, are actually one of our investors. But what we have is an alternative to the barcode, and I would say an evolution of RFID into something that will be a lot bigger, thanks to some very large companies that I'm going to be talking about shortly. But essentially, we sell, or rather our partners manufacture under technology licenses from us, IoT Pixels, which are postage stamp size compute devices. And we have a relatively modest team. We've got about 220 employees spread all around the world. One country that's not mentioned here is Ukraine. We have actually an incredible team that are still working very effectively there. The company has been around for 6 years. We have some amazing investors from Amazon and PepsiCo, technology companies like Qualcomm, the largest mobile semiconductor company in the world, Samsung, Verizon, NTT, and then shipping giants like Maersk. And Merck is the drug company behind M Ventures. So we rely on standards for what we do, and there's some incredible inventions that have come out of the work that we've been doing to commercialize our product. Now let's relate that to FSMA. Essentially, this data carrier, this way of automatically reading without tapping and scanning the cases and crates of produce and food that are flowing through the system, is the route to a no labor, low labor compliance model. And we think that's really important. If we're going to get the kind of accuracy that is mandated, then relying on everyone being perfect employees is probably not the way to go. And when you put what we describe as a visibility platform in place, it turns out is actually useful for a whole bunch of other things. And those other things can be the source of a very compelling return on investment that can be the key to getting the gold standard compliance that I think every food safety professional wants. And they can then partner with their colleagues in supply chain and help them solve the problems around omni-channel accuracy. One of our biggest customers, one of the largest grocery chains in the world, actually deployed our platform primarily to solve that problem, to get the kind of accuracy to avoid mispicks, misshipments, all the things that get between people buying online and picking up in store in a reliable way. But also it can be about improved store operations efficiency. You'll see an example of that later. Reducing waste with perishable products. And on the environmental side, a new paradigm of real-time carbon footprinting, where you don't just get a report card at the end of the year, but carbon is reported in real time so that everyone can manage down carbon and manage down cost at the same time. So let's bring that to life a little bit. We have a platform upon which many applications can run. These would typically be the kind of food safety applications that you might be familiar with from the likes of Trustwell, FoodLogic, IBM. So we're not an apps company, but we have developed a mobile app, which is for demonstration purposes now. We may well be releasing this on the App Store before the end of the year, and it allows you to browse the data from our tags. And we describe it as being a browser for the real world, for browsing places and things. No need to tap or scan. We're going to open source it, and it's standards based. So I'm going to show you a video of my iPhone browsing a tag. You'll get a sense of hearing, seeing, and remembering. And the hearing is hearing the assets, the items that are nearby. You'll see those at the IDs at the bottom of the screen. And then as we pan to the asset with a Wiliot tag on it, an IoT Pixel, we see when it broadcasts in AR. We can see that every pixel can measure temperature. So we not only get to see the current temperature, but the temperature history, the source, and we can also browse the critical tracking events and the carbon footprint in real time for that particular asset. So let's put this into some context. Ambient IoT is really just a progression of computer automation, miniaturization, Moore's law, which started off with mainframes the size of buildings. There were a few thousand of them. They cost millions. That gave way to desktops. There were millions of them because they cost thousands. And then that same compute power was reduced to hundreds of dollars, and we saw billions of smartphones. Now we have a device with an ARM processor, memory, end-to-end encryption, sensing, which will be less than 10 cents next year. And the market forecast from companies like IDC is for trillions of those eventually, by the time they're connecting every single thing. And with them is a new generation of networks that went from proprietary mainframe networks to ambient IoT networks that run on Bluetooth, but will also being run on the Wi-Fi networks and the cellular networks. And we'll talk about that momentarily. So what is ambient IoT? If you look at the dictionary, ambient says existing, or it says existing or present on all sides, which is a great description because you can put these tags on every single thing, whether it's luggage, tools, there's no batteries to run out. And then everything around us with a radio, ultimately, as the standards roll out beyond just the Bluetooth today, you can see Wi-Fi access points, appliances, smart speakers, all reading these devices. So the key here is commodity, low cost, both for the tags and for the infrastructure. So if we compare Ambient with RFID, there are a lot of similarities. Basically, Ambient IoT is an evolution of RFID. If anyone has a company that's invested in RFID, then that's a great start to embracing Ambient IoT. But Ambient was born much more recently, born with the cloud in mind, which means that it works a little bit like a Tesla. You can have upgrades in functionality over the cloud that can ripple through tags that are already deployed. It has sensing. Every tag is a temperature sensor. Will be a grocery shop demonstrating humidity sensing later this month. There's privacy, data ownership, security that you don't get by default with RFID, and this ability to use the infrastructure that's already been paid for, and where that needs to be supplemented, going from readers that cost thousands of dollars to something that is 100 times cheaper. These Bluetooth devices are tens of dollars that are required to give a robust visibility. So no surprises, the Bluetooth SIG, the people supporting this standard are very bullish on the future, and they're echoing this 10 trillion number. RFID tags, there's probably 30 to 40 billion of those. So this is a significant scaling up and really a realization of the original vision of the Internet of Things as it was originally conceived back when Procter & Gamble pioneered it a few decades ago. So this technology is being embraced within the Bluetooth SIG. We use the standard as it is. It's actually continuing. There's a meeting going on this week on how to build on what we're already doing. But there's also other standards organizations, 3GPP, who define 5G and 6G, are working on release 19 of their standard, which we will know as 5G Advanced. And the IEEE that define Wi-Fi also have a task group working on an 802.11 standard. And what this translates to is more scale, lower cost, and some of the largest technology companies in the world, the AT&Ts, the Verizons, the Apples, the Samsungs, the Ciscos, taking on what was arguably lacking in the RFID world, where it was definitely kind of niche companies that may be less household names. So this is one of the reasons why we see this scaling. So time for me to pause, and before I hand over to Frank, we have a chance for another polling question, which is, do you have an ROI that justifies the investment for everything that you need for compliance? So obviously we think having a platform that can support many use cases is part of the key to that, but this is new news, so I'm assuming that you won't be including that in your calculus. So ROI is obviously critical. I assume, I don't know, Frank, what your experience is, whether the food safety professionals have the entire budget required for compliance or not.
They don't. I think now with the rule imminent and clear that food companies are going to have to comply by January 2026, companies will loosen up their dollars and give them the capital and investment needed to comply. But I see by the way these results are coming in, Steve, that it was a great question, and it's a timely webinar because we're making the case that there's a way to comply and not only meet the FSMA regulation, but add yet additional value to your business.
Yeah, so there's clearly a need for a compelling ROI to get what people need. There's capital, typically, there's process changes, there may be some infrastructure, even if the infrastructure is much lower cost than traditionally is there. So it seems to me this is a recipe for partnering across the organization, as well as making the case for the necessity to comply to the law. So interesting results from people, 71% a no, and 28% a yes. So an opportunity, a problem that needs to be solved. And this is probably a good time for me to hand over to you, Frank, for the next segment.
Sure. Thanks, Steve. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about Section 204, the food traceability rule, which is final now. And the state of the nation. And let me just begin with, you're going to hear me in a pretty succinct fashion talk a little bit about major elements of the rule that I think everyone needs to know. We're going to really emphasize 4 points in particular: this concept of key data elements and critical tracking events. This is what I call creating standards so that the entire food system, which is pretty large and distributed, speaks a universal language of food traceability. We're going to talk about traceability lot codes and the importance of them, and as they're required by the rule itself. Many of us have seen in the food continuum for products that have multiple layers. Sometimes a product through its life cycle journey can have multiple lot numbers, sometimes assigned not with the real need or requirement in mind, but people like to assign lot numbers, so it becomes very difficult to follow chain of custody. And then we're going to speak a little bit about the food traceability list, the types of foods that are going to require this additional record keeping. But I really want to start off with this idea of why. Why FSMA 204? Why better food traceability? Why is it so important? The why, as you know, Steve, informs what we do. So I always like to start off with the why. Listen, let me begin by saying, Steve, I love the technology, and I'm bullish on Ambient IoT. But my entire career, I've said that it's never really about the technology. It's about the public health or business problem that we're trying to solve. I'm just so excited that Ambient IoT is around to help us solve this. We often talk about today's food system, and I actually think today's food system is pretty impressive when you think about being able to go into your favorite grocery store and find 50 to 70,000 different food items or SKUs available for a fraction of your hard-earned dollar. It's really impressive. But I've often stated that today's food system, and I've experienced this up close and personal, both in the private and public sector, has what I've described as an Achilles heel. It's the best way I can think about it, an Achilles heel. This big, impressive, decentralized, distributed, but interdependent food system has an Achilles heel, and that's a lack of food traceability. I could spend 30 minutes talking about examples that I've experienced both in the private and public sector where this point is made crystal clear. For example, the spinach outbreak of 2006, many of you will remember all spinach nationwide pulled off all grocery store shelves and off all restaurants because there was an outbreak of E. coli 0157H7. It took FDA and CDC 2 weeks to trace that product to the source. And when it was all said and done, it was one producer, 1 day's production, one lot number. An entire industry devastated, and sales, they tell me, didn't recover for 6 or 7 years. We often talk about a food chain, but in reality, Steve, it's not a food chain at all. I've used this complicated, interconnected, and distributed, yet dependent food system. How about PCA? In 2009, many will remember a company that produced a small volume, 2 to 3% of the peanut paste in our country, yet that product ended up in thousands of different SKUs. And I can remember being at the world's largest retailer and executing recalls of products that contain PCA peanut paste 3 months, no exaggeration, 3 months after the initial recall. Product that could be potentially contaminated sitting on grocery store shelves for 3 months. That's the idea that this food system has an Achilles heel, and it's a lack of food traceability and maybe, better stated, food transparency. Now, that's why FSMA is so important. What's in the rule itself? Well, I want you to know that we finalized the rule at FDA while I was still there in November of 2022. So the final rule is out. And the good news, what I'm seeing, and even if you saw how some of these poll questions have been answered, Steve, is that the conversation is changing. It's no longer a conversation about, do we really have to do this? It's going to be too hard. Maybe there should be lawsuits. The reality is there was a lawsuit because Congress always gave FDA the requirement or the mandate to write a food traceability rule. And FDA took a while to get to it. Consumer groups sued FDA. We settled the lawsuit during my tenure while I was there. And so we went on and wrote the rule. So I think the industry now realizes the compliance date is real and we have to get on board and comply. And most, as we could see through the poll results, believe they'll be able to achieve the compliance date. As I mentioned, it's really centered on a few core concepts. And I give the team at FDA a tremendous amount of kudos. I was so impressed with the men and women that worked on writing the rule itself, because I describe it as having a very 21st century lens on how do you write a food traceability rule. Up until now, we've been largely dependent on requirements in the Bioterrorism Preparedness Act that said one step up, one step back traceability, without any specificity or clarity on what you had to track and trace. I led the foodborne outbreak team at FDA for about 5 years. I tell you, on every single outbreak that occurs in the United States, being able to track those foods to source is very complicated, because the way this large and distributed food system does it is very different. Still largely paper-based, but the way people put information on paper, whether they're invoices or spreadsheets, it's not formatted the same way. And the challenge given to public health professionals that are trying to determine the source quickly is really daunting. It's really, really difficult. So what they did is they said, well, let's identify the key data elements, the critical tracking events that need to be kept at each node or point in the food system, just within your span of control, so that if desired, we can paint that chain of custody quickly from production to sale, or from sale to original origin. In other words, again, I'll use this example again. It's the equivalent of everybody in the food system speaking the same language of food traceability. It's the key data elements. What are the types of data attributes that you have to keep? Where was the product produced? Where was it harvested? What product or commodity was produced? How many units, for example? The critical tracking events are where in the food continuum do these records have to be kept? For example, first receiver, first land-based receiver or harvester, when you receive and ship foods, if you transform a food, these are places where the records have to be kept so you can have that chain of custody if desired. The food traceability list is a specific requirement that Congress gave FDA. They told FDA, you're not going to be able to require food traceability for all foods, but we want you to require it for those foods that are frequently implicated in foodborne illnesses, that have a high burden or cost to society at large. And they gave us several factors to work on. And the FDA did a risk ranking based on the factors Congress gave them in Section 204 of all foods and created a prioritized list. Through that ranking exercise, we created something that we called the food traceability list. Now, let me be clear. In years past, prior to us writing the final rule, people often referred to it as a high-risk foods list. The FDA intentionally did not call it a high-risk foods list because the reality, any food can be high risk if not handled or produced appropriately. So it's just the list of foods that are going to require this additional food traceability record keeping. And I'm going to show you the list in just a second. Now, what I am seeing, though, Steve, as I talk to food service companies and food retailers, and I'll talk a little bit about the return on investment, there's a large share that are saying, I don't think we're going to split hairs and only require this for foods on the food traceability list. We think this is good for all foods because there's benefits beyond food safety. There's benefits to supply chain efficiencies. There's benefits to reducing food fraud, which I'll talk about in a bit. So I'm seeing a lot of companies take an approach that they're going to cast an even wider net than the food traceability list. And then the compliance date, as you've already heard Steve mention, is January 2026. Why is it worth repeating and mentioning over and over? Because January 2026 is right around the corner. You know, making these types of changes, getting ready is something that I encourage companies to start on right now. It's not something that you can wait until the year before, or you're going to be really stressed and probably not in compliance. And so it's a relatively short window for the types of changes that need to happen. And I encourage you, if you haven't already, to develop a multidisciplinary team within your organizations, because the food safety team can't do this alone, and begin figuring out what are the gaps in your ability to comply right now, and what do you have to do to be in compliance by the compliance due date? And very importantly, is there a way to comply that goes beyond the food safety benefits, which are huge in and of itself, should be done, but also add yet additional value to your business? Let me go to the next slide, just so that you see real quickly the foods on the food traceability list. And I'd encourage you to visit FDA's website to get more detail on this. But it's the types of foods that we've heard involved in illnesses and outbreaks over the past several years. Cheeses other than hard, so the soft cheeses that are sometimes contaminated and documented illnesses. Clearly, we've heard of listeria in some of these soft cheeses, but other pathogens as well. Shell eggs, nut butters, peanut butter outbreaks have reoccurred. Almond butter, other types of nut butters, cucumbers, fresh herbs. We all have heard concerns about herbs such as cilantro or parsley. Leafy greens, obviously, if you haven't seen the movie Poison, you should. It frames fresh leafy greens as the new hamburger. And while we realize this at FDA, that on any given day, there's over 100 million servings of fresh leafy greens that are consumed safely every day in our country, when the outbreaks have happened, all too often they have been implicated with fresh leafy greens. Melons, whether they're cantaloupe, honeydew, watermelons, peppers, sprouts, alfalfa sprouts, mung bean sprouts, all varieties of tomatoes, tropical tree fruits. We've heard of outbreaks associated with mangoes and papayas. In fact, up until an initiative that we led, we had 8 outbreaks associated with imported papayas into the United States. Fruits and vegetables, once they're cut, we understand the risk of cutting produce and then adding contaminants that might be on the surface of rinds, for example, into the interior flesh where they can multiply. Fin fish, including smoked fish, crustaceans, mollusks, and ready-to-eat salads. So again, I encourage you to go out there and take a look at what's on the FDA website. I've not done this as of yet, Steve, but I hope to. I want to calculate, if you look at the total number of SKUs in a grocery store, this is a pretty big footprint. You walk into a grocery store, where do you start? Generally in produce. And produce sections have extended and got larger over time, right? There are lots of hundreds of SKUs in the produce section alone. And if you think about your grocery store, this covers a wide section of it, other than maybe the meat and poultry counters that are regulated by USDA. And again, I'll emphasize, I would encourage companies to think about even going a little bit further. Now, one of the questions I get, well, what if we produce a food that's on this food traceability list, but it gets sent or we receive it and we further process the food? If you have a microbial kill step validated and documented, you would no longer be required to continue that traceability. But if you don't, traceability still would require for the product that now contains an ingredient that was originally on the food traceability list. Now, I said, really, we talk about food traceability, but I believe the end goal is really greater transparency. And what's the opposite of transparency? Oftentimes I ask this in public sessions and people will answer, well, it's opaqueness, it's darkness. One of my favorite definitions is that the opposite of transparency is anonymity. You just don't really know. And I can tell you, working at the height of federal service, working at the world's largest company, talking with some of the world's largest food producers, we think they know, but they really don't know. We really don't know where food comes from all the time. We don't know how it was produced. We don't know what the standards, and there's a lot of anonymity in the food system. And fundamentally, if you believe in organizational dynamics and human behavior, is anonymity generally a good thing? Would you want to put a bank teller somewhere where it's dark and anonymous and try to pull money out of that bank teller at 2 a.m.? No. If you wanted to make sure that students were really acting ethically and taking exams, would you want them to take those exams where there's no proctor overseeing it? No. What we want is transparency, because transparency is a really powerful force that tends to help organizations and people and even food producers self-govern their behaviors. And so transparency is a big idea when it comes to food safety. Now, let me close with this, Steve, before I turn it back over to you. You talked about an ROI. And working at FDA, we had some great food economists. And when you're going to write a rule of that nature and get the Office of Management budget to agree and not get a lot of heat or pushback from stakeholders and congressional leaders, you have to do a cost-benefit analysis. And if you're interested in this, it's published in the rule itself. There is a cost-benefit analysis on the food traceability rule. And I think we settled this once and for all. There is a strong return on investment from a public health perspective for food traceability in terms of illnesses avoided, reduced lost lives and better quality life years, in terms of reduced medical cost, absences due to people not showing up to work. And then the recalls, right? Some of these recalls have gotten very extensive, very large, incriminating products that we know are not affected. So just on food safety alone, there's a cost-benefit analysis. And I suspect that's the case for your organizations as well. When I worked at the world's largest retailer, Steve, I had 4 full-time equivalents for food recalls alone. That's how common these food recalls were in the food system. And so I'm pretty sure that for many organizations, there's a return on investment on food safety, better food safety, and more narrow prescriptive recalls, surgical recalls alone. We've shown that for the nation. But if you look at the other benefits that are derived by greater food transparency, they're profound. Think about food fraud. The cost of food fraud is pretty significant. I can remember a time not too long ago when a retailer that we operated in the UK when I was in the private sector had to pull lots of products from their frozen cases because the product said, for example, ground beef in the lasagna, and there was no beef in that product at all. It was horse meat. Now, why do you think that happened? Because there was a lack of transparency in what was really happening. And these types of measures and visibility are deterrent to that type of unscrupulous behavior. How about your compliance costs? Every year we know compliance costs are going up, whether you have to comply with regulations on food safety by FDA, USDA, or private sector requirements. We think having a digitized, interconnected food system allows you to track and monitor compliance activities a little bit more easily. How about freshness and food waste? We all have heard that a third of the food that gets produced gets wasted. Unacceptable in today's society. In some of the traceability work I did when I was in the private sector, we showed that if we had better tracking and tracing of foods, we can pinpoint where there were opportunities for supply chain efficiencies and remove days out of the production and distribution to the consumer. And every day that you removed in that continuum is a day of freshness you give back to the consumer. And we saw, for example, small tweaks that could result in tens of millions of dollars of less waste in food. And then transparency is another benefit. You know, we're living in a day and age where there's what I call a consumer trust bust. And I like to say whether it's political scandals, and I know there are way too many of them these days, whether it's financial crisis or contaminated food, it all results in the same thing, a lack of trust by consumers. And so these new technologies can instill or impart that kind of trust that I think the American consumer deserves. And so I want to make the case that with leveraging these types of technologies, I do believe you can probably show that there's a pretty strong ROI on creating a more transparent and traceable food system. So let's do one quick poll, Steve, before I hand it back over to you. And the question is, what do you think are the main factors that will drive the best return on investment? I've tried to give you a broader view on the benefits of better food traceability. Could it be labor reductions? You heard Steve describe Ambient IoT as being no labor or low labor, where you don't have to scan cases. Impact on your brand, creating greater trust. Increased sales by freshness. I know that there's additional efficiencies that can drive even greater freshness in foods. And then there's some food products just I won't buy because it doesn't seem like they're fresh enough. Or is it reduced cost due to more narrow and pinpointed recalls? And we know these recalls can be very, very expensive, you know, millions, if not tens of millions of dollars. You see the results coming in. It looks like they're stabilizing there. And obviously, we've all seen that our inability to track and trace foods efficiently has resulted in recalls that are messy, overly expansive, and very costless. And very importantly, they do a lot of damage to consumer trust. When you pull all romaine lettuce on Thanksgiving holiday, It's not something that consumers forget about really quickly. But you see there's labor reductions and increased freshness. And in time, I think, as organizations start doing their own proof of concepts, Steve, I think they'll be able to quantify the benefits in a variety of these buckets a little bit more clearly.
Yeah,
right,
I think it's interesting that labor reduction is number two, and that to me, we're tapping into the wisdom of the crowd, the audience here of professionals that are focused on this area, and it seems like there is a trend to introducing automation for compliance that may have a broader ROI, and I think that's good to hear. So, Frank, thanks for that. We'll move on to my second and last section, and we're going to do kind of a drill down into the more practical elements of ambient IoT and talk about how it's applied to FSMA. But Wiliot has over 700 customers. They range from very small pilots, proof of concepts, to work with very strategic projects with our largest customer, many people's largest customer, large grocery chain. We had a kickoff meeting with 60 people in it. And I remember coming back to that project, a review several months later, where there were a few things that really stuck in my mind. And one was the fact that ambient IoT was their best bet. This was something they said, not us, to comply with FSMA 204. And that really brought back the fact that we were participating and very fortunately were one of the winners in, Frank, your FDA's food traceability challenge. And that was really the thing that triggered us to reach out to Frank. And we were pretty skeptical that he would return our call, knowing that he tends not to work with technology and solution companies. So again, thanks, Frank, for joining our advisory board. Okay, so a recap. This time in the words of a television network, we've got a 2-minute video that just recaps, and is probably one of the better ways of articulating what this technology is all about. I love it, apart from the fact that I'm in it, which makes me cringe, but I hope this is useful 2 minutes for you.
A tech startup tracking thousands of products across the supply chain in an effort to reduce waste. The company uses Bluetooth technology to monitor foods, medical supplies, and other items with limited shelf life. And businesses are signing up to manage their inventories and cut their carbon footprints. CNBC senior climate correspondent Diana Olick with us now, continuing her series on climate startups. Diana, how does this work?
Well, Shep, you may have heard of the Internet of Things, IoT. It means items that are embedded with sensors or software. And in the case of a startup called Wiliot, it's tiny tags attached to food, medicine, and other items that track every aspect of their lifespans in order to reduce waste.
It's this ability to drive a very lean supply chain with only just the right amount of products that are in the right place at the right time, which we think is one of the keys to solving climate change.
They do it with these stamp-sized computers powered by Bluetooth and attached to any product or packaging, from vaccines.
It allows us to measure the temperature, the location, the authenticity.
To zucchinis.
Each zucchini that goes into a crate joins a unique monitoring path.
Smart crates monitoring everything moving from farm to fork. Wiliot is working with label giant Avery Dennison, which is manufacturing millions of these tags and connecting them to the cloud so they can be tracked anywhere, anytime.
By knowing where a product is, what's happening to it, where it's from, you can act faster. And so it's about taking data and turning it into actionable insights.
Insights that ultimately work to decrease waste by monitoring delays and shelf life. Wiliot is seeing massive demand as the makers of just about everything strive to reduce their carbon footprints.
Last quarter, we quadrupled our revenue, and I expect when we leave this year, then that growth will be on an even steeper trajectory.
Statler says clients include some of the largest pharmaceutical, apparel, and grocery companies. Backers so far, Avery Dennison, Verizon Ventures, Amazon, PepsiCo, Samsung, and SoftBank. Total funding, $270 million. And not only can this technology reduce waste, but it also enables companies to quantify far more accurately their carbon footprints from the point of manufacturing to consumption. That'll be really helpful for corporations as new regulations on emissions are clearly coming. Shep.
Diana, thanks very much.
So thanks to CNBC for that coverage. So let's drill into what this architecture looks like. We don't expect you to be experts, but this hopefully gives you a sense for what's involved with having coverage of vehicles and distribution facilities. So we're seeing some really large deployments of this technology with tags going on crates and cases. And then these readers, which rather than costing thousands of dollars, cost tens of dollars. They're Bluetooth devices. We have literally tens of thousands of vehicles that are now being fitted with these. That's actually beyond what you need for FSMA compliance, but it is giving us visibility to things like the temperature of strawberries, which it turns out get frozen and defrosted multiple times on their way from a distribution center to a storage facility. These bridge devices are a way of tracking location as well as reading the tags, energizing them and relaying to gateways, which can be phones, can be Wi-Fi access points. And then all this data goes to the cloud and applications. So I wanted to give you a sense of what we mean by real time. Or near real-time visibility. This is something that is very useful for this world of buy online, pick up in store, as well as for generating these critical tracking events without anyone being required to tap or scan anything, as well as delivering quality improvements, increasing shelf life by reducing temperature excursions, and helping to figure out where things have come from. What you'll see now is a map that we did of a product. It's not a food product in this case. This is real data from a real store that showed the movement of detergent, a case of detergent where there was a misshipment and so there was no place to put it. And we see it moving around in real time between the store and the back room. Eliminating that sort of thing is one of the ways to drive an ROI, and it hopefully gives you an illustration that we can have the kind of next generation visibility required for robust critical tracking event records. So food safety is really an application that sits alongside omni-channel inventory and supply chain visibility, real-time carbon visibility, and also going beyond omnichannel, leapfrogging into the home. So we all have Bluetooth in our appliances, in our smart speakers. So our focus is really in the enterprise, but our customers know that there's a future where food products auto-replenish, their expiry date is tracked in the fridge, and this is where things are going. And by focusing on a real problem now, they're getting ready to compete in the future. So what our solution enables is a data carrier that can, a tag that can be associated and correspond to a traceability lot code. So a Wiliot IoT Pixel ID already has a GS1 serial GTIN, Global Trade Identifier. This is basically just a unique number that can be associated with anything, but it can be associated with a traceability lot code. It can even be reassociated if there's a food transformation. And so the gathering of these critical tracking events can be automated. You're not relying on everything going perfectly. And again, we are simply feeding into best of breed applications that have broader food safety applications from many of the names that you know and trust. So we were really pleased when Gartner, in a report on technology evolution, they call them hype cycles, cited Wiliot as one of the prominent companies to be looked at for food safety and traceability. This was a global study focused on the Asian market, but it's the same analyst that deals with the US market as well. So hopefully that recap helped draw a few dots. We've only got 10 minutes left, so I'm going to hand back to you, Frank, just to have some closing remarks on the future of compliance.
Yeah, I'll be succinct so that we can allow some time for questions, but I want everyone to just pause and imagine where we're going with technologies such as ambient IoT. We have the opportunity in front of us to make a generational type change that will change the compliance paradigm in the work that we do. Very briefly, let me just tell you that I believe that we've been operating using a 20th century compliance paradigm for food safety in a lot of professions. If you track to the left of this slide here and the words I have there, think about the work that we do. We basically oversee the safety and compliance of two types of assets: the facilities that make food, the locations that produce food, and foods themselves. Those are two different types of assets. Think about what we do. We write standards of identity for the foods. We write maybe microbial or product specifications for the foods, and then we periodically test them to see if they're in compliance. That's a 20th century paradigm. For the assets of locations that produce food, we might write good manufacturing practices or GMPs. We might write HACCP plans. There's FSMA preventative rules or FSMA rules that these facilities have to comply with. And then what do? At least at FDA, we would send inspectors in there once every 3 years or once every 5 years, very infrequently, to see if those facilities were operating in a manner that's compliant with what's written on paper. That's an old paradigm. We're actually a quarter of the way into the 21st century, the data and digital age, and we're still operating on this old compliance paradigm. But with what you've just heard today, we have the ability to give these assets, facilities and foods, digital identities and digital voices. That's the bottom row there you see on the left, through sensor technologies. As we capture more information about these assets in digital form and are able to track more data attributes about them, we can increasingly track other data attributes that are important, for example, weather. And now we have at our fingertips the availability of new tools such as machine learning or artificial intelligence and others that can take big data that in the past we couldn't do much with and convert that data, bridge the divide to predictive and powerful preventive information. On top of that, if you go up this layer, you can see we can move away from the once every 3 years or once every 5 year inspectional model to a more dynamic risk-based prioritization process using more insights than ever before. And we can move to a day where we inspect facilities or test foods, not because they're on the 1 year cycle or the 3 year cycle, but because insights is telling us we need to do something about it. And then I think it affords the ability or opportunity to provide new compliance oversight tools. I don't think there's anything that will ever replace the in-person inspection, but there'll be other tools, whether the remote audits, whether it's monitoring critical control points remotely, or leveraging other virtual tools. And the analogy I like to use is this, is that we have the tools, we've just discussed them in front of us, to convert from the model that we're using today, a black and white snapshot, a photograph of how a facility is conforming over time, to a world in which we're digiting the equivalent of 3D live food safety streaming information. And so that's how we're going to change the compliance paradigm. And with tools like this, I'm convinced that working together, we can create a safer, smarter, and more sustainable food system. With that, Steve, I'll turn it over to you for the last word.
Yeah, Frank, thanks so much for your support for what we're doing. I'm going to just refer people to a few sources of follow-up information. We have information, basics information on the FSMA 204 rule on wiliot.com. We have a whole range of social media channels that can give you insights into news. There's the podcast I mentioned, which is called Mr. Beacon, where Frank has been a guest, but also Julie McGill from Trustwell, Ed Tracy from the Fresh Produce Association. So we really look forward to seeing you on there. And hopefully, if any of your executives or you are going to grocery shop in Las Vegas later this month, then we have a sizable presence there, and one of our founders will be presenting. But now I'm going to hand it back to Adrian, who can hopefully squeeze in a few questions.
Great. Well, thank you so much for this great presentations, Frank and Steve. And before we get to a few questions here, I'd like to remind you that we love your feedback. So please take a few moments to complete our webinar survey, which you'll see on your screen momentarily, or you'll also be redirected to it at the end of the program. So we have a few moments for questions, and we've got a lot of good questions coming in here. I'd like to combine a couple of questions into one for you, Steve, here about the pixels themselves. So a lot of attendees had questions about things like their durability, especially in high versus low temperatures, and if they can be wet or not, how they measure temperature, and then what are they made of? Are there any plastics or trace metals used in the construction? Could you comment on some of those elements?
Yeah, absolutely. So Wiliot IoT Pixels are made using the same production technique and the same machinery, and frequently by many of the same companies that are making RFID. So we think we can go beyond RFID in terms of cost reduction, but today the tags for a project that's rolling out less than 10 cents for an individual pixel, which is very durable. So we did some work for Pfizer where we integrated them with COVID vaccine vials that were cryogenically frozen, and then as they were defrosted, the tags worked. Because they're battery free, they're much more durable. The materials, currently we use copper for the antennas. It'll be aluminium or aluminum, as people around here would say. And we have PET, which is used in RFID, but we're actually starting to work with a company called Westrock, one of the largest makers of cardboard boxes for companies like Amazon and Walmart, where we print the antenna directly onto the cardboard and then glue the chip onto the antenna to reduce the cost even further by dispensing with a lot of the layers that would be normally in a tag. Readers, tens of dollars. There's a cloud element, which is actually the part that we provide, which is very modest. And those are kind of the cost equations that are made up by labor reduction, obviously the compliance element, but also fewer out of stocks, fewer misshipments, and better visibility that you can start to offer. And we see the ability to reduce waste as well and improve food quality by having end-to-end cold chain visibility as the tags flow through, and they can actually be embedded in cases and crates for really long-term durability that can last for years.
Okay, great. Thank you, Steve. And also another person was asking about if you could explain the application of the labels on food items such as meat or poultry or seafood. And I know another person had a question about, and you just kind of talked about this, about, how would you use this when you have like a bulk truck of harvested fresh fruits or vegetables? For example, a truckload of tomatoes, if it makes several pickups from different farms during the day. So to keep the tracking information separate for that, like, can you comment on some of that?
Yeah, absolutely. So each case and crate would typically have a pixel. The moving to case level tracking is actually a huge change for many grocery companies. So that's our focus. We've done projects in Japan where people have put a pixel on an individual head of lettuce. That's maybe a thing for the future where you have recipes that tell you how to use up food that's expiring. But we're working with one of the largest makers of shipping containers, embedding, works with Wiliot radios that can read the identity of cases and crates as they're added into a vehicle. So you get a real-time view and the scanning happens automatically. And so we can then track the location that the crate was added and pair that with the identity of the crate in order to maintain that visibility and traceability.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Steve. And I'm going to take time for one more question. I know we're over the hour here, but I want to ask a question to Frank here. I'm going to combine two into one. So first of all, Frank, where can people find the traceability if they want to reference all this information? And then also, I think you'll like this question. One of the attendees asked if there are any real teeth to FSMA. They said they've spoken to stakeholders and some of them don't seem to be very concerned. So if you could comment on that.
Well, to find more information about the food traceability rule, just get on your favorite search engine and just put FDA food traceability rule, and it'll take you. They have an entire page with links to everything you need to know. They've done a good job with educational material. And there's going to be a lot more in the way of education awareness. Is there teeth to FSMA? I would say, the agency has struggled with its compliance posture, and it started off with this stance of educate before and while you regulate. I believe the agency needs to move on the continuum towards stronger compliance. And so I think, yes, there is teeth to FSMA. I think there's a realization at FDA that you have to move beyond the education portion of the continuum and get to enforcement. And I would tell the industry they should expect on some of these rules that are now becoming mature that they'll move to compliance more than education. Now, for food traceability, I hope that they start with the educate before you regulate.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Frank, and thank you, Steve. And this was a great discussion. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have for questions today, but please join me in once again thanking Frank Yiannas and Steve Statler for their presentations, as well as today's sponsor, Wiliot. Now, if you have any additional questions or comments, please don't hesitate to click that email us button on your console, and we'll share those with our presenters, as well as all the questions that we didn't get to today in our Q&A, and they can respond directly to you. And if you didn't get a chance to fill it out earlier, you'll be redirected shortly to that post-event survey. We always look forward to hearing how we can make our programs work better for you. Also, please make sure to visit food-safety.com/webinars for the archive of this presentation to share with your colleagues, as well as information about our other upcoming events. So we appreciate your time, and we hope you found this webinar to be a valuable experience. Hope you all have a great day.